Hello again everyone, and welcome back. We find ourselves in the last days of the Metamorph League, and Delirium is on the horizon. I have time to cover just one more build, and although this will be more of a classic staple than something off meta, what better to wrap up this league than one of the ultimate league starters, an iteration on the tried and true Raise Zombie Necromancer. What this build lacks in novelty, it gains back in raw power, ease of gearing, overall flexibility, and unbelievably strong defensive capabilities. This style of build has always had a dedicated following, but has risen to overwhelming levels of popularity in the last two leagues. This is due almost completely to the huge rework that they saw in 3.8, with summoners suddenly becoming more powerful, easier to control, and significantly easier to gear. But perhaps most notably, summoners were given the ability to directly modify the AI and behavior of their minions directly via powerful new support gems. This rework proved to be pretty fantastic overall, and truly made summoners more satisfying to play and significantly more accessible to the average player. Even despite some minor nerfs in 3.9, Necromancers still remain locked as the most popular build type in Path of Exile right now. Even if the build receives additional nerfs with the arrival of Delirium, it will undoubtedly remain very strong. It could lose a huge chunk of damage and effective life, and it would still be one of the most versatile and tanky builds out there. We'll be summoning a massive horde of 15 plus zombies that will be supported by multiple specters, a carrion golem, and an animated guardian. The ratings you'll see here are going to be representative of the core version of the build. However, through provided alternatives for our gearing, skill tree, and even our minion setups, you can focus on and improve whatever you'd like. The version of the build represented here is tuned to be exceedingly tanky, but still clears maps decently quickly, with a horde of zombies fueled by Feeding Frenzy support. You won't be breaking any records, but you'll still be shredding through even the highest tiers of maps at a very reasonable pace. The single target, however, is fairly potent and can take down even the strongest bosses in a very small amount of time. While you stay completely out of harm's way, your minions will descend upon your enemies, obliterating Elder Slayers, Guardians, and even Cyrus as well. On top of this inherent offensive capability, this build with investment can become one of the tankiest out there, and can reach up towards and even exceed 20,000 effective life just about constantly with our buffs active. Furthermore, with all of our defensive investment pushing our evasion chance over 70% and our physical damage reduction over 70% consistently. And to top it off, we have a potent Vol Discipline to keep us alive, an activatable bone armor for additional damage mitigation, and an almost non-stop fortify buff from our animated guardian. All of this combining to make us one difficult target to take down. With the recent changes, the barrier of entry in terms of gearing up a summoner is truly this low. Minions have so much inherent power that you don't have to spend many skill points or gear slots to ensure that they're doing enough damage. The pressure on the gear just isn't there. Just about every unique used in the build is exceptionally common and can be found or purchased for quite cheap even early in the league. The rest of the slots can comfortably be filled with average rare gear and common flasks all the way through the axe and into the early mapping. With even a reasonably optimized set of gear, you should be able to comfortably take down even the deepest endgame. Of course, when optimizing any build, the expense will increase, and to fully gear out this build as you've seen in the video will take a bit more currency. This build's flexibility, defensive power, and scalability make it one of the best starter builds available. The playstyle will not be for everybody, but if you want to barely die, push some high levels, or just want to try something new, this is an easy recommendation. This build guide utilizes the free program Path of Building to display and summarize its information at a glance. If you're watching this in a league following 3.9, this build will have been updated with any necessary changes. You'll find a list of those changes in the notes section of the Path of Building or in the description of the video. The Path of Building will contain multiple skill trees and gear sets for the different stages of your character's progression. For easy navigation, timestamps for every section of the build guide are available in both the description and pinned comment below. And if you're enjoying the guide so far, consider subbing to the channel for more build guides just like this. Let's get started by taking an overview look at our endgame skill tree, as it does a great job of establishing what this build is trying to accomplish. Note that the skill tree we're taking a look at is my core recommendation, which is tuned to be very tanky. In the Path of Building, there will be alternative trees for those who want to go in a more DPS focused route. You'll notice right away that our tree is quite expanded. Normally when making a build, this isn't the best idea, and you'll want to keep your tree quite condensed. However, this build has such an appetite for strength and defensive nodes that covering all of this extra ground really doesn't affect us negatively. Offensively, we'll only be picking up a tiny handful of nodes, with a focus on increasing the maximum number of zombies and specters we can summon, as well as increasing our minions' attack speed, movement speed, accuracy, and overall damage. Beyond these few nodes, just about every skill point we have access to will be spent on scaling our defensive capabilities, primarily increasing our strength, life, maximum energy shield, life regeneration, which we'll be converting into energy shield regeneration, elemental and chaos resistances, and increased armor. The very few points that we don't spend here are going to be spent on additional utility, picking up a variety of jewel sockets and a single node cluster that will reduce the mana reservation of our auras. The tree may look complex, but its objectives are very simple, and it does an incredibly good job of keeping us alive. Next on the agenda is going to be our Ascendancy selection, which is the Witch Ascendancy of Necromancer. We'll be utilizing these 4 nodes, the first of which is Mindless Aggression. It simply increases our minions' movement, attack, and cast speed, and increases their damage a bit as well. Our second Ascendancy node is Unnatural Strength, which increases the level of all minion skill gems by 2. Increasing both the inherent power and DPS output of each individual minion, as well as helping us increase the maximum number of specters and zombies that we can have summoned at one time, by hitting specific thresholds that those gems have that increase the amount of inherent minions that they provide. Our third Ascendancy will be Bone Barrier, which heavily increases the maximum life of our minions and grants us increased physical damage reduction, elemental resistances, and life and energy shield recovery rate for every minion we have active, up to a hard maximum. On top of all of that, it also grants us the active skill of level 20 Bone Armor. This is very similar to the Steel Skin buff, but lasts significantly longer. It is applied directly to our minions as well. When active, it essentially absorbs 70% of the damage from hits that we would have taken, up to a maximum total of 2,209 damage. This has a low cooldown and can be activated quite frequently during boss fights and just casually while mapping, effectively extending our life pool even further. And the consistent and pretty gigantic boost to our resistances makes gearing even easier. And that brings us to our fourth and final node, Mistress of Sacrifice. This node increases both our skill effect and minion duration, as well as causing our offering skills to directly affect us at a slightly reduced level of effectiveness. We'll be combining this Ascendancy node directly with Spirit Offering, which we'll have up just about constantly in both mapping and bossing situations. We'll discuss the offering in more detail later on, but most notably, when active, it grants our player 15% of their maximum life as extra maximum energy shield and an additional 22% to all of their elemental resistances. All of that extra energy shield makes a big difference and is a heavy increase to our effective life pool, and once again, the increased resistances make gearing that much easier. Between these two Ascendancy nodes, we get plus 52% to all of our elemental resistances when Spirit Offering is active and at a high level. Each of these Ascendancy nodes play a very distinct and important role in making this build possible. When progressing through the labyrinth and earning your Ascendancies, I would recommend going in this order. I would first pick up Mindless Aggression, followed by either Unnatural Strength or Bone Barrier, depending on whether you want to go in an offensive or defensive route early on. Whichever you don't select, I would pick up for your third Ascendancy, and when you finish your Uber Lab, I would finally pick up Mistress of Sacrifice. By that time, you should have a high-level Spirit Offering ready to go so you can gain maximum benefit from the Ascendancy node. Moving along now to the Pantheon selection. For both the Major and Minor God, be sure to capture all of the additional souls to gain the maximum benefit from running these Pantheons. For the Major God, due to our already high chance to evade, the best selection may be Soul of Lunaris. It grants us situational movement speed and physical damage reduction, as well as some additional dodge and chance to avoid projectiles entirely. For the Minor God, there are a few really solid options. Soul of Shikari will reduce the amount of chaos damage that you take, and the additional soul will grant you complete immunity to poison. I recommend running this soul in most situations, but there is some additional consideration for the Soul of Rislatha. This will grant your life flasks additional charges during longer boss fights and increases the amount of life you gain from flasks when you use them on low life. I would only really recommend this soul for some of the most difficult encounters like Uber Elder and Cyrus. With that covered, next on the agenda is a quick stop on the Bandit selection. While some of the Bandit rewards are somewhat helpful, they just aren't good enough. We can make efficient use of every skill point we can get our hands on. Thus, my prime recommendation is to bury each and every one of them and collect your 2 passive points from Aramir. Moving onward now into the skills and links that fuel the build. In this section, we'll be taking a look at the individual setups, explaining some of the reasoning behind our decision making, and providing some alternatives when possible. What specters we'll be using, how to set up our animated guardian, and tips for optimal mapping and bossing will all be covered in the sections following this overview. Up first will be our core Raise Zombie setup, which will be a 6-link composed of these gems, which you'll be socketing directly into your endgame weapon. Ideally, we want to have Raise Zombie at as high a level as possible with as much quality as possible. With every level we can stack, heavily increasing our zombies' damage and increasing the maximum number of zombies that we can summon at certain thresholds, being level 20, 25, and 30. And with optimal gear, our ascendancy, and helpful support gems, we can indeed get Raise Zombie all the way to level 30. We'll be linking Raise Zombie first to Feeding Frenzy support. This changes their AI to be directly aggressive, causing them to automatically target any enemies within a gigantic radius around our character. They are also granted basically constant access to the buff Feeding Frenzy, which inherently grants our minions 10% more damage and 10% increased movement, attack, and cast speed, following Feeding Frenzy's small nerf in 3.9. On top of that, the gem also grants an additional 14% more damage to just the zombies themselves because they are directly linked to it. Our next two links will be minion damage and melee physical damage support. At their core, our zombies do completely physical damage, and these two supports are one of the most efficient ways of scaling that damage heavily. For a 5th link, we'll be utilizing Multi-Strike. If you've played any sort of melee build before, you probably know the power of this gem. This significantly increases the speed at which our zombies attack and causes their attacks to trigger 3 times in a row. The initial swing will deal less damage, but the resounding 2 repeats will each deal more damage overall, with the end result being more frantic and devastating zombies. And that brings us to the final link of Empower support, ideally at level 3 or level 4. This gem will directly increase the level of Raise Zombie, as well as increasing their maximum life pool, improving their DPS, and lowering their cooldowns. The additional levels also help us reach those thresholds that we need to have more active zombies at one time. When Empower is at level 4, it will increase Raise Zombie's level by 3, but when combined with our optimal endgame weapon, Empower can reach level 7, which in turn will increase the level of Raise Zombies by a total of 6. This provides our zombies with an incomparable boost to both their life total and overall damage output, and is the perfect gem to wrap up our core 6-link. Until you pick up that Empower support, here are a few alternatives you can run temporarily. Marching onward now to our next setup, which will be a 4-link containing both our Animate Guardian and Raise Spectre. Ideally, we'll be socketing this directly into our unique helmet, the Baron, in order to take advantage of its +2 to all minion gems. Much like Raise Zombies, you'll want to have Animated Guardian and Raise Spectre at as high a level as possible. This is crucial when trying to keep your Guardian alive, and with Raise Spectre at level 21, combined with the +2 from your Ascendancy and the +2 from the helmet, will put it at level 25, which breaks a difficult threshold that will then allow you to have 4 active Spectres rather than just 3. We'll be linking Animate Guardian and Raise Spectre first to Blood Magic support. This allows your Spectres to attack and cast as fast as they'd like with no concerns of mana usage, most notably allowing them to spam war cries that buff both us and our other minions by providing charges. For the 4th and final link, you can either use something like Meat Shield or Minion Life support. Meat Shield will cause both your Guardian and Spectres to stay as close to you as possible. This can be ideal, as your Guardian's buffs will only affect you when it's nearby. Meat Shield will also provide some additional movement speed and cause them to take significantly less damage. Alternatively, you can choose to run Minion Life support if your top concern is making sure that your Spectres, and more notably your Guardian, doesn't perish in combat. Both will serve the build's purposes fine, but in very different ways. Proceeding onward now to our main aura setup. This will be a 4 to 6 link depending on what you have available to you, and will ideally be socketed into your body armor. As a summoner, we use a lot of mana to initially summon our minions, but all 4 types we'll be utilizing don't actually go away unless they die, meaning that we can very easily reserve a huge amount of our available mana, leaving just enough to cast a few small spells. When minions need to be resummoned, you can just deactivate an aura for a second, and you'll be good to go. We'll be utilizing 3 major auras, being Pride, Flesh and Stone, and Vaal Discipline. Pride reserves the biggest chunk of mana at 50%, but causes nearby enemies to take 19% more physical damage, a number that rises up to a maximum of 39% if they stay in the aura for a total of 4 seconds. This aura is entirely here to increase our zombies' DPS, and in my opinion is well worth the high cost. Next is going to be Flesh and Stone. This aura has two different modes that you can switch between at will. While in Sand Stance, you'll be blinding nearby enemies, making them significantly less likely to hit you. And additionally, you'll be taking 11% less damage from enemies that are far away. This mode is best used during mapping and in very dangerous boss encounters where you'd rather have more survivability than DPS. When you want to start dealing some damage though, you can switch into Blood Stance. This will automatically maim any nearby enemies, reducing their movement speed by 30% and causing them to take 16% increased physical damage. This aura was a late addition to the build and is not featured in the footage at the start. However, it remains an incredible addition to the build and comes highly recommended. And finally, that brings us to Vaal Discipline. We'll be utilizing both the core Discipline aura and the activatable Vaal Discipline. The Discipline aura itself grants us a huge amount of flat energy shield and increases our energy shield recharge rate by 30%. Vaal Discipline is an activatable skill that for 3 seconds will prevent our energy shield recharge from being delayed by incoming damage. This makes it a phenomenal panic button for use in situations where you take a lot of damage in a very short amount of time, giving you those few crucial seconds to recover without interruption and stay in the fight. These 3 auras alone will reserve the majority of your mana. As long as you picked up the Sovereignty cluster on the skill tree, you should be able to run all 3 with no issue. However, if you'd like to expand this setup further, you're going to need an Enlighten support, at least at level 2. This will reduce the mana reservation of any aura that it's linked to. The higher the level of Enlighten, the less mana that the auras reserve. With a level 2 Enlighten, you can expand your setup to a 5 link that includes Maim support. Maim itself is not an aura, it simply links to Flesh and Stone, but because it has a mana multiplier, it will increase the amount of mana that Flesh and Stone reserves, causing all enemies that are maimed by Flesh and Stone while it's in Blood Stance to take an additional 14% increased physical damage, further increasing the amount of damage that our zombies do. With a level 3 Enlighten, you can just keep running Maim, or you can replace it temporarily with Dread Banner. Dread Banner causes you and nearby allies to have a chance to impale as well as increased impale effect, and will also cause nearby enemies to have significantly reduced accuracy rating, making you even more difficult to hit. Regardless, once you get an Enlighten at level 4, you can be running both, with an endgame 6 link that will look something like this. This setup, like many others in this build, is very flexible and doesn't need to be fully optimized to achieve good results. Next on the list is going to be our Cast While Channeling setup. This will be a 4 link that you can have in either your gloves or your boots. We'll be utilizing the channeling skill Cyclone to essentially automate our spirit offering, allowing us to keep it up basically non-stop with very little effort. As we actively use Cyclone intermittently while mapping and bossing, it will create corpses below us, which will then be immediately consumed by Spirit Offering. This consistently results in us getting the strongest and longest lasting Spirit Offering possible, granting both us and our minions huge amounts of energy shield, resistances, and damage. And with that, we've arrived at our very last setup. This will be an amalgam of a few different types of gems. None of these actually benefit from being linked together, and you can socket these into either your gloves or boots, whatever's left. First and foremost, we'll be using Convocation. This spell instantly recalls all minions directly to your location. Normally, minions will respawn to your location after you run far enough away. However, this only occurs at a very set distance. With Convocation, you can trigger this at will, giving you the ability to directly shepherd your minions wherever you'd like, greatly increasing your minions' effectiveness and overall clear speed. Next up is going to be our 4th and final minion, Summon Carrion Golem. For relatively no cost, this thing will run around dealing some decent damage and grants all of our other minions additional physical damage. And that brings us to our final 2 sockets. These are very customizable, but for me, I liked running Flame Dash in conjunction with Withering Step. Flame Dash simply providing us with the ability to dodge quickly and pass through certain doors and over gaps, making mapping smoother overall. Withering Step is phenomenal when combined with our Quicksilver Flask. When you activate Withering Step, it will grant you the Decaying buff Elusive, heavily increasing your movement speed and your chance to dodge both spell and attack hits, while also providing you with phasing for its entire duration. We can summon minions to our location with Convocation, and then hit our Withering Step and our Quicksilver Flask to start moving at ridiculously high speed, with our minions following close behind. Alternatively, you could use something like Phase Run, or low-level versions of Precision or Clarity, which either provide minor benefits to the build, or have great Watcher's Eye mods for those with a high budget. And with that, we've covered my top recommendations for these skills and links. From here, we're going to quickly discuss the basic strategies for mapping and bossing with this build, before breaking down some of the ideal ways to set up your Spectres and Animated Guardian. Let's begin by discussing how to handle mapping. When clearing maps, almost all of the work will be done completely by our zombies, with our other minions mostly serving to support them. Summoning your zombies and other types of minions can be done just about anywhere, even in your hideout. This can be accomplished by casting Desecrate to create a small pile of corpses on the ground. Each zombie you summon simply requires a single nearby corpse. The type of corpse itself doesn't matter and will always result in identical zombies, and as long as they don't directly die, they will persist between different areas and maps, allowing you to often play for a huge amount of time without having to ever resummon a single one. If you log out, they will go away however and have to be resummoned. This minion build is tuned to have a somewhat relaxed but still pretty involved role. The majority of your focus will be on shepherding your horde through the map, making sure that both you and your minions stay alive. You'll be using Cyclone every so often to make sure that your spirit offering stays up consistently. You really won't need to spam it as the duration is quite long. Just work on learning the timing. As you progress through a map or fight a league mechanic, you'll want to occasionally use Convocation to recall all of your minions to your location. How frequently and in what situations you choose to do this really come down to your personal playstyle. Beyond keeping the spirit offering up and occasionally directing the horde, you'll want to make good, consistent use of your flasks and use Withering Step to both speed up and phase through enemies. Any additional downtime you might have will most likely be spent looting. You may find yourself surprised at how quickly you can map with minions. With both your character and your minions having very fast movement speed, your zombies will be decimating everything within several screens of you. The playstyle, like many summoners, is going to be very relaxed, and our sheer tankiness means that you won't be in danger very often. If you take the time to learn the basic playstyle and optimize the build even slightly, you'll find yourself dying very, very rarely. Bossing with this build is relatively simple. Your number one priority, of course, is to stay alive. Thus, if you'd like to leave Flesh and Stone in Sand Stance and keep some major distance from the boss, do so without hesitation. The greatest strength of running a minion build is having them do the work for you. You don't want to be putting yourself in harm's way unless you're feeling pretty comfortable. Regardless of whether you keep your distance or not, be sure to have your spirit offering up at all times. If you want to deal some optimal DPS, make sure Flesh and Stone is in Blood Stance and stay fairly close to the boss to make sure that Pride, Flesh and Stone, and Dread Banner all have their intended effect on both the enemies and your minions. You can also manually place your Dread Banner during boss fights if you earned up some stages during the map. Bosses you're really comfortable against, go all out, but in exceedingly difficult, chaotic, or dangerous situations, keep your distance. Ensure that your character lives to run another map. Next on the agenda, we're going to be discussing the basic functionality and core setup for our Animated Guardian, as well as some alternative options and tips to keep your Guardian alive. Animated Guardians are quite the oddity. You can only ever have one active, and they persist between logins. Using the Animate Guardian skill on a piece of gear that's resting on the ground will cause the Guardian to equip it permanently, with these items being limited to helmets, body armor, gloves, boots, weapons, and shields. Any gear that you choose to equip is not tied to the gem itself, it's directly tied to your account. So if you were to buy a level 21 version from another player, it would not have any of their items equipped, and would have equipped any previous items you had attached to a different Animate Guardian gem. Finally, it's exceedingly important to remember that if your Animated Guardian dies, you lose every item you had equipped to it, and you'll have to start over from scratch. Fortunately, most of the gear I'll be recommending is quite cheap, but there will be some items that come heavily recommended that will be fairly expensive. As a result, you may want to simply level your Animate Guardian gem without having it active until it reaches a fairly high level, at least 15 or more. The higher the level, the more life it will have, and the less likely it will be to die. If you're using very cheap or throwaway gear, you can have this active the whole time. Just be aware you may lose the gear if you're not paying enough attention to the Guardian's health. With all of that covered, let's cover some gear recommendations for our Guardian. For the helmet, we have two fantastic options. First up is Mask of the Tribunal. Thanks to the unique helmet that we the player have equipped, the Baron, half of our strength is added to our minions. When heavily optimized, we'll have over 1,800 strength. Combining half of that with other sources will grant our Animated Guardian over 1,000 strength, which will increase the defenses of both us and our other minions by 60% when the Animated Guardian is nearby. With my full endgame setup, this provides my character with over 1,100 energy shield, an additional 7% physical damage reduction, and 4% chance to evade. Alternatively, you can run Mask of the Stitched Demon. Combining this helmet with Spirit Offering in nodes like Grave Intentions, your Animate Guardian will have a huge amount of unusable energy shield, but for every 500 maximum energy shield, it will gain 1% of its life regenerated per second, with the end result being an almost unkillable Animate Guardian. I ran Mask of the Tribunal as I wanted my character and my other minions to benefit more than I wanted my Animate Guardian to benefit. Through hundreds of maps, I never ran into a situation where my Guardian died, so my top recommendation is the Mask of the Tribunal, but if you want to be 100% sure it won't die, utilize Mask of the Stitched Demon. The body armor selection does not need to be linked and is quite flexible. My top recommendation is simply running a Belly of the Beast for a huge amount of increased life and some added resistances as well. When trying to scale life on the animated Guardian, always go for percentage increased maximum life over flat life, as the Guardian already has a huge base life pool. Alternatively, you could choose to run the much more expensive Gruthgal's Pelt. It does indeed have flat life, which will result in a lower life pool than Belly of the Beast, but the 5% of life regenerated per second makes a big difference, but this is only a worthwhile upgrade if you've already optimized almost everything else in the build. For most players, I would recommend going Belly of the Beast. For the gloves, we have two really fantastic options. If you're going with Mask of the Tribunal, I would pick up Meganord's Vise. These gloves grant another 2% of life regenerated per second and further scale the Guardian's strength, increasing our defenses even more as a result. Alternatively, you can run Southbound, which provide the Guardian with a huge amount of increased life and cold resistance. For the boots, my top recommendation is very simple. Run Victario's Flight. They'll provide the Guardian with a fair amount of movement speed, 10% of which it shares with both us and our other minions. And finally, that brings us to our weapon selection. For those on a somewhat tight budget, you can temporarily run Dying Breath. It will provide a decent damage boost to all nearby allies. But when you do have the funds, my top and only real recommendation is to run Kingmaker. This weapon is truly ridiculous and grants all nearby allies, including us, increased item rarity, Culling Strike, 50% critical strike multiplier, and non-stop fortify. This item will prove to be somewhat expensive, but is one of the best upgrades you can make for the build and is incredibly worth the money. Taking the time to properly set up your animated Guardian will make a meaningful difference, and provides both you and your other minions with huge offensive and defensive buffs. With all of that covered, let's move on from the animated Guardian and discuss how to set up our Spectres. A level 21 raised Spectre that gains +2 levels from our unique helmet, the Baron, and another +2 levels from our Ascendancy, Unnatural Strength, will break the threshold barrier of level 25, allowing you to inherently summon 3 total Spectres. Combining that with the Node Death attunement on the skill tree will allow you to then have a maximum of 4 Spectres available. Summoning a Spectre requires a nearby corpse, which will be consumed to make a specific spectral copy of the monster's corpse that you chose to target. The created copy will follow you around, fighting for you and using the skills that the monster had in life. Thus, by only targeting very specific monsters, we can create a hand-picked, special operations team of Spectres to support our legion of zombies. As long as they don't directly die, they will persist between areas, maps, and even logins. When trying to target a specific corpse, you'll need to know which key you have bound to toggle corpse targeting in the first place. I don't recommend having corpse targeting set to always on, as it can make looting and interacting with objects like strongboxes somewhat annoying. You'll only ever need to have it active when you're trying to resummon or replace a Spectre. If you have some Spectres die or unequip the gem and need to resummon your Spectres, you can simply use Desecrate in your hideout, and some of the corpses that will be spawned will be recently raised Spectres. If you already have your maximum number of Spectres active, raising a new one will replace your oldest one. The only question that remains is, what Spectres should we use? My first and foremost recommendation is to raise 2 Carnage Chieftains. These will grant both you and your other minions with consistent frenzy charges, and having raised Spectre connected to blood magic allows them to spam this ability, ensuring that our zombies will almost always have the maximum number of charges, giving your zombies a nice increase to both attack speed and overall damage. You can very easily find these in the Old Fields in Act 2 and the Ashen Fields in Act 7. As your third and possibly fourth Spectre as well, I would run Host Chieftains. Much like the Carnage Chieftains, these will grant you and your minions with consistent power charges, heavily increasing our zombies' critical strike chance and their overall DPS as a result. These can also be easily found alongside the Carnage Chieftains in the Ashen Fields in Act 7. If you're at the point in your build's development where you can only have 3 maximum Spectres, your job's done here. You can very comfortably run 2 Carnage and 1 Host Chieftains until you unlock that 4th Spectre. When you do, you can choose to just run another Host Chieftain if you'd like, or if you feel that your minions are gaining enough consistent power charges already, you can run a single Merveil's Retainer as your final Spectre. This will automatically cast the Curse vulnerability on nearby enemies, significantly increasing our zombies' DPS against them. You can easily find one of these by crafting or buying a map that has the modifier Areas Inhabited by Sea Witches and their Spawn. Alternatively, if you wanted to go in a slightly more defensive route with your 4th Spectre, you can raise something like a Reanimator. These summon some little zombies of their own and cast Enfeeble on nearby enemies, lowering their critical strike chance, accuracy, critical strike multiplier, and overall damage. Just a phenomenal defensive curse all around. You can find these very easily in the Lunaris Temple level 1 or level 2 in Act 3. All of these various configurations and options will serve the build well in their own ways, so test out a few different setups and see what works best for you. With all of our minion setups covered, it's time that we discuss some leveling strategy. We'll take a quick look at the leveling skill trees, discuss what gems you should be using at what stages, and cover some helpful pieces of gear. We'll be leveling this build through and through as a summoner. In the early game, we'll basically be mirroring the first part of our endgame skill tree, scaling our defenses through multiple life nodes, and improving the power of our minions with nodes like Lore of the Dead, Ravenous Horde, and Death Attunement. The mid-game will be more of the same, picking up more life nodes and some helpful minion nodes like Grave Pact and Righteous Army. The leveling will be very flexible. Our minions have a lot of inherent power, so we won't be needing to scale that very heavily. The majority of our focus will be on simply scaling our defenses and picking up the most powerful and available minion-based nodes. Next, let's discuss the active skill gems that will fuel your early progression. Raise Zombie is available from level 1 and can easily be scaled from there. Here are some of the helpful support gems that you can use as they become available. Alongside Raise Zombie, I would recommend using Summon Raging Spirit for as long as necessary. It becomes available at level 4. You'll have to manually cast these, but they do significant damage and help make the early leveling experience much smoother. Here are a few helpful support gems for those as well. When you reach level 10, Summon Skeletons will become available to you. They can do some really good work. If you decide you want to mix these in and use them for part of the leveling process, here are some helpful support gems. At level 12, you'll gain access to both Flesh and Spirit Offering. You may want to use Flesh Offering early on, as it will heavily increase your minion's attack and movement speed temporarily. At level 24, Convocation will become available and will help you direct your minions where you want them to be. At level 28, Raise Spectre will become available. You won't be able to have many of them at one time. With the few Spectres you do have, you could choose to run support and raise a Carnage Chieftain from the old fields in Act 2, or you could raise a DPS-focused Slave Driver from the control blocks in Act 5. Here are a few helpful support gems if you choose to improve the power of your Spectres. At level 34, you can pick up Summon Carrion Golem. You don't really need to support this directly with any gems, but it will do some good work, powering up your other minions. As far as auras go, I would recommend running Pride, Flesh and Stone, and Dread Banner as they become available to you. Flame Dash and Withering Step will both make traversing through the acts a lot more enjoyable. And finally, that brings us to the leveling gear. What gear you choose to use early on is exceedingly flexible, as we won't really be actively scaling strength until much later on. Here's a huge variety of cheap and widely available leveling uniques. You can choose to run as many of these as you'd like, or even none at all. Just using decent rares that you find during the leveling process will be more than enough. If you're going to make one single investment, I would pick up a Queen's Decree at level 27 and look to upgrade it, or simply hold off until level 38, at which time Queen's Escape becomes available to you. Finally, be sure to make good use of commonly found flasks. Ideally run at least one Quicksilver flask, if not two, a decent life flask, a mana flask if needed, and fill any additional slots with something like a Jade, Basalt, or Granite flask. With all of that discussed, it's finally time for us to move into our endgame gear selection. Path of Exile's economy and subsequent item prices are completely player-driven, meaning that the cost of an individual item will shift with time. As a result, I use more broad tiers of cost to better estimate the future price of an item, those tiers being cheap, 0 to 20 chaos, moderate, 21 to 100 chaos, and expensive, being anything over 100 chaos in price. Now let's begin first with our endgame weapon selection. If you're on a budget or early in a league, your best two options will be Queen's Escape and Femurs of the Saints. These will both be likely very cheap unlinked and only somewhat expensive for a fully 6-linked version. Furthermore, both of these are good enough to be scaled all the way into the deepest endgame and can be used permanently. Queen's Escape is phenomenal if you want to be mapping very quickly, providing the build with more minions, increasing their life and their damage, and most notably, increasing their movement speed by up to 100%. Alternatively, Femurs of the Saints is an incredible option all around. Offensively, it increases the level of socketed minion gems and their damage significantly, and defensively, it provides a big chunk of block chance, and with 17 zombies active, you'll be regenning an additional 10% of your maximum energy shield per second. Both of these options are fantastic, and more than capable of taking down all content. However, once you've earned up some funds and you're looking to fully optimize the build, the true endgame is running a weapon like this. These are going to be much more expensive, but the overall DPS you gain is staggering. If you look to pick up one of these, your primary focus will be getting the +1 to level of socketed gems, the huge boost to overall minion damage and minion attack speed, and the +2 to socketed support gems. This will of course raise the level of every gem in your 6-link setup, but most importantly, it increases the level of Empower by 3, which in turn increases the level of Raised Zombie significantly. A weapon like this is certainly not required, but should be one of your top goals if you're looking to push the build as far as it can go. The next few gear slots are going to be somewhat more rigid, as the unique items used compose the heart of the build. Fortunately, each of them are quite common and will most likely be fairly cheap even early in the league. The first of these core items is going to be our helmet selection, which will be the powerful Baron. Available for quite cheap, this helmet is absurdly good from top to bottom. It makes our minions more tanky in multiple ways, gives us some flat strength, and does two very notable things for the build. The first of which is causing our minions to leech a percentage of their damage, which is given back to us as life. And second, the maximum number of zombies that we can have raised at one time is increased by 1 for every 300 strength that our character has, meaning that when fully optimized and we have over 1,800 strength, the Baron provides us with an additional 6 maximum zombies, which is just absurd. As a result, this helmet is basically required, but enchanting it is not. I comfortably ran this build through almost all content with no enchantment whatsoever. If you have a ton of money and you're looking to optimize the build, the enchantments that increase our zombies' attack speed or damage will both be quite helpful. For almost everyone else, focus on getting a well-rolled Baron. The second core piece of gear will be our body armor, Joffrey's Sanctuary. This build stacks strength, and if you're stacking strength, you need Joffrey's Sanctuary. Fortunately, it should be quite cheap unlinked, and expensive but attainable fully 6-linked. It provides a good amount of flat armor, energy shield, life, and resistances, making it fantastic overall. It forcibly grants us Zealot's Oath, converting all of our life regen into energy shield regen, and most notably, grants us 2 maximum energy shield for every 5 strength we have. This results in a staggering amount of base energy shield that we'll be scaling with our very next item, which will be our glove selection, the Shaper's Touch. These will be quite cheap for most of the league, and offer some base armor and energy shield, alongside a variety of different modifiers that scale off of our attributes, most notably of course our strength, granting us when the build is optimized around 900 flat mana, and increasing our energy shield by around 360%, effectively increasing our energy shield by over 7,000, making them, like many of these other items, essentially required for the build. Because these are only available in deep late game, you can temporarily run something like Meganord's Vise until Shaper's Touch become relatively available on the market. Next on the list is going to be our boot selection, with my top recommendation being an Alberon's Warpath, which once again offer a chunk of armor and a little bit of energy shield, but most importantly, increase our strength by a maximum of 18%. Providing a very meaningful boost at a very cheap price tag. Alternatively, you can of course run a pair of rare boots, ideally being a pair that not only has high life, resistances, and movement speed, but also has a high amount of flat strength and percentage increased strength as well. For most every player, I would recommend just picking up a well-rolled pair of Alberon's Warpath. Regardless of which you choose, here are the best boot enchantments available to us. With this being a minion build, there are only a few enchantments that do anything at all, with the best 2 options either being the life regeneration or the movement speed. Moving along now to our amulet selection. There are 2 really good choices here, the first of which is going to be the moderately priced Astramentus. This amulet is simply a huge pile of stats, and is a perfect candidate for use with intrinsic catalysts. It provides the build with a huge amount of much needed strength, and immediately shores up all of our other attributes as well. For those with a high budget that are looking to optimize the build further, I'd recommend picking up a rare amulet, specifically an example that has not only a high amount of flat strength, but also has both percentage increased attributes and percentage increased strength as well. Any additional life, energy shield, or resistances that you can stack on top of that will just be icing on the cake. An amulet like this will prove to be somewhat expensive, and needs to be fairly decent to outclass Astramentus in the first place. And much like Astramentus, this is a fantastic candidate for use with intrinsic catalysts. Regardless of the route you go, you'll want to be anointing this amulet. My top recommendation is to anoint Death Attunement for a silver, a crimson, and a clear. For only moderate expense, you'll save the 5 points needed to get all the way up there, which can be reinvested elsewhere in the skill tree. victory. Alternatively, you can do something very similar by anointing Ravenous Horde for 2 Opalescence and a Verdant Oil. This will indeed save you 6 points rather than 5, but removes multiple minor nodes and a full notable from the radius of our Lethal Pride Jewel. I'll be discussing that jewel in more depth very shortly, but essentially having more allocated nodes within its radius grants us more strength, enough to be worth the 1 point of inefficiency needed to pick up Ravenous Horde directly. Thus, my only real recommendation for anointment is picking up Death Attunement. Up next on the agenda is going to be our ring selection, which will be 2 flexibly priced rare rings. When picking these up, your focus should be on getting 2 things: a really high strength roll and as many resistances as you need. You'll be getting plenty from both your Spirit Offering and Bone Barrier, so it shouldn't be too tricky to fill out the rest right here on the rings. Beyond that, try to grab any life, energy shield, minion damage, or minion movement speed that you can get. And with that, we've arrived at our very last piece of core gear, being our belt selection. Ideally, we'll be running a heavy belt in order to stack as much strength as humanly possible. Our top priority will be getting another high strength roll in addition to the inherent implicit, as well as the modifier percentage increased attributes, with a secondary focus of getting any life, energy shield, or resistances you can. A good example of a belt like this will most likely be somewhat expensive. If you're on a budget, simply drop the percentage increased attributes and just get a really solid all-around heavy belt that has as much strength as possible and any of these secondary focuses that you need. Alternatively, you could run a moderately priced Cyclopean Coil. If you go this route, be sure to get a high roll on the percentage increased attributes. Both of these belts will once again be fantastic candidates for use with intrinsic catalysts. With that, I think I've covered all of the main gear selections and alternatives that I'd like to discuss. We only have 2 sections left now, the first of which is going to be our flasks. Up first will be our Quicksilver Flask. These will typically be fairly cheap. The prefix here is very flexible, with reduced charges used, increased effect, and increased duration being some of the best options. The suffix, however, should be an additional roll of percentage increased movement speed, as close to 30% as possible. The Quicksilver Flask is not required, but goes a long way towards making mapping feel smoother and more enjoyable. Our second flask will ideally be a Rumi's Concoction. Available for quite cheap, it increases our armor significantly and grants us a reasonable chance to block both attack and spell damage. Our third slot will be occupied by a cheap Basalt Flask. This gives us another significant boost to our physical damage reduction. The prefix here will be completely up to you, but the suffix should either be of heat or warding. In the fourth slot, we'll be running a cheap Jade Flask. This provides the build with yet another huge defensive boost, increasing our chance to evade very heavily. Once again, the prefix is very flexible, but the suffix should be whatever you didn't choose for your Basalt Flask, either being of heat or of warding. And that brings us to our very last flask, which will be a cheap, divine, or eternal life flask. This will be the same song and dance. The prefix is completely flexible, but optimally, the suffix will be of staunching, providing the build with one last key immunity. With that, the flasks are completely wrapped up, and we finally arrived at our very last stop, the jewels of the build. Up first will be the moderately priced unique jewel, Efficient Training. We'll only be using one directly in the build, and it will be socketed right here. It provides a little bit of inherent strength and completely transforms all of the intelligence within its radius into more strength. Speaking of strength, let's get a little bit more with another unique jewel, the slightly expensive Lethal Pride. We'll be placing it directly into this jewel socket right here. Lethal Pride won't directly change what our notables do. Instead, it adds additional strength to all of the minor nodes within its radius, granting +2 to all traveling attribute nodes and +4 to all minor nodes of a direct cluster. It then adds a new modifier to all of the notables within its radius. What modifiers the jewel adds is completely determined by its random seed. As a result, you may have to use a few divines before the jewel lands on a helpful seed. How picky you are will be completely up to you. There are quite a few good modifiers, but we'll be looking for 2 in particular. 5% increased strength and +20 flat strength. With 5 notables within the jewel's radius, we have a few shots to land on these modifiers. Even just getting 2 or 3 of the 5 nodes to have a helpful strength-related modifier will be enough to have a decent jewel. We still have about 5 sockets remaining, the majority of which will be filled with rare jewels that look something like this. These will be flexibly priced, with your top priorities being percentage increased maximum life and getting as much strength as possible. In the very last remaining jewel socket, you'll want to place a flexibly priced Ghastly Eye jewel that looks something like this, with your top priority being the modifier Minions Leech up to 0.5% of their damage as life, which provides our minions with one more really solid defensive layer and one that's quite easy to pick up. Alongside this modifier, any life, strength, energy shield, or helpful minion modifiers will all be fantastic additions to your final jewel. And with that, we've wrapped up just about every topic that I can think to cover, and we've finally arrived at the conclusion of this build. Like many others, I was pretty slow to give minions a real shot, but builds like this one have shown me just how powerful minions can truly be. The playstyle is surprisingly satisfying, and both clears maps and crushes bosses much faster than you might expect. The sheer flexibility, ease of gearing, and simply absurd defensive capability makes this build a powerful contender to take on Delirium, and truly is one of the most compelling League starters available. I highly recommend giving this one a shot. It will not let you down. A huge thank you goes to all of my patrons for their continued support of the channel. It's truly appreciated and helps make this content possible. Special recognition goes to the following for their dedicated support of the channel: Anlei Huang Bao, R.O. Briggs, Elixium, Andrew Miller, Andy, Bloody, Brandon Kendrick, Chris Sherrick, Christopher Cravey, Christopher Murdoch, Daniel Wigg, Darren Clark, David Lackamy, Gareth Thomas, Greg Wells, Jacob Davey, Ken Butler, Kurt Wood, Michael Johnson, Mick Woodney, Modimus Prime, Ray Hill, Richard Bollinger, Sinister Data, Stefan RCH, Thomas Pashik, and Zolaris. Thank you so much, everyone. If you'd like to be credited at the end of each of my videos, or join our Discord for Path of Exile and channel discussion, consider checking out the Patreon link in the description. Finally, if you managed to make it this far, thank you so much for watching. I hope the video proved to be both helpful and entertaining. If you have any questions at all, leave them down below and I'll do my best to answer. Consider subscribing to the channel for more build guides just like this. And as always, I've been SRO, and I will see you guys in the next video.